Good afternoon, everyone. We will call ourselves back to order. Thank you all for returning. We will continue on with closing remarks and begin with Ducks Unlimited. So I'll turn it over to, I believe, Mr. Kenyon.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, this is Jamie Kenyon from Ducks Unlimited Canada. I'm the Yukon manager. I just wanted to thank the board again for the opportunity to present at this hearing. Wanted to take some time and just kind of go over some of the take-home messages that we talked about yesterday, and kind of what we've heard from other groups related to that. I'll start with the concept of no net loss of wetland benefits. There was a number of groups that also brought up this concept as a way to try to move forward, as a way to kind of set some of those, or look at how you assess and provide licenses on an application by application basis. A no net loss approach would ensure that many of the socioeconomic and ecological benefits of wetlands would be maintained. And I just want to also kind of at this point try to clarify some of my remarks from yesterday that I think may have been misunderstood. We heard this morning from Ms. Rudolph at the KPMA that said that it was her belief I said that reclaimed wetlands do better, or something along those lines. But I'd just like to sort of re-explain or make sure that everybody understands where I'm coming from, is that different wetland types perform they all perform very similar functions, but they perform each function slightly differently. So it's more of a measure of orders of magnitude, or the amount of a particular function that we're looking at that these wetlands, these different types of wetlands provide. So some reclamation activities that replace one wetland class with another may result in some certain wetland services being enhanced, but at the same time, it may also cause some wetland services to be lost. And it's also important to note that, even with reclamation and a no net loss approach, that we can get close to keeping or maintaining those benefits on the landscape, but in general, a development's full footprint is usually typically a negative once you start including in some of those cumulative impacts. A second message that we had yesterday during our presentation involved the precautionary approach. And once again, this was something that was brought up numerous times. Right now, there is that lack of understanding of cumulative impacts. We don't know where those tipping points are. And what this results in is that some of these reclamation, we don't necessarily know, how well or how successful reclamation is. What this means is that decisions have to be made very carefully because we don't know the outcome of some of these decisions. We have to be very careful because we may be going too far, and as some people have stated, it's possible that we have gone too far. Linking this back to no net loss, that's one approach to trying to implement a precautionary principle, and this is through the adoption of a mitigation sequence. And Randy Newton from CPAWS this morning showed a nice graphic of what that mitigation sequence looks like in terms of, at first you avoid any impacts, then you minimize them, and in situations where you can't avoid or minimize, then you have to get into the reclamation and offsetting potentially. We also, in our comments yesterday, said that some types of wetlands may not be appropriate for placer mining to occur in, such as shallow open water and marsh habitats due to their rarity, as well as bogs due to their sensitivities. And setting aside some of these wetland types does fit in with the precautionary approach. Adaptive management was also mentioned, and again, Randy Newton from CPAWS gave a great overview of this, and I'd say I agree with what she presented. We need some goals for whether it's reclamation or for how pass-through licenses are awarded and the practices used. And then we start monitoring those and determine what is working, what isn't working, and make adaptations based on that. And some of this will be informed by some of the research that we highlighted yesterday that does need to be done, such as better understanding of hydrology, permafrost, and some of the reclamation approaches that we suggested. I also want to take some time now and touch on Government of Yukon's presentation on their interim policy for the Indian River wetlands. We do have some concerns about this approach. We think it has significant limitations, and we have concerns that it will not be successful. As we explained yesterday, the feedback cycle that we believe occurs as you change hydrology, and which therefore degrades permafrost, which then changes hydrology, and you get that cycle. It leads to a footprint being much larger than the actual mined area. And this footprint could potentially grow over time due to that feedback cycle. This, with the 40% retention of fens within a claim block of the approach of Yukon government, that it doesn't take into account that those impacts to those areas that aren't being mined. Because of this, we're not convinced that they'll be able to achieve their goal of wetland conservation. And because of not achieving that goal, the second goal of their approach, which is to have a more effective licensing process, will also not be achieved. Finally, I want to address some comments that were made yesterday by the Yukon Chamber of Mines regarding methane release in wetlands. Excuse me. It is true that wetlands do produce methane. This is a part of the natural process of wetlands. And in fact, when we look at the different wetland types, marshes are actually one of the higher producer of methane on a per unit area than the peatlands. It is also true that methane is a potent greenhouse gas. However, it is also relatively short-lived in the atmosphere, especially compared to carbon dioxide. When a peatland is mined, much of the carbon that is stored within it becomes available for oxidization, as was explained, and is released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The carbon that is in the peatlands has accumulated over millennia, and it is very long-lived in the atmosphere. So once the peatland is mined, that carbon that has been not in the atmosphere for many years, or many thousands of years, will be available to be in the atmosphere for a very long time, which will have impacts on climate change going forward. And with that, I look forward to presenting the board with our written comments, and where we'll address these issues as well as the questions the board asked us yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kenyon, and thanks to Ducks Unlimited. We'll move then for final comments from the First Nation of Na-Cho.
Thank you and good afternoon, Mr. Chair. My name is Nuri Frame. I spoke to you yesterday. I'm legal counsel for the First Nation of Na-Cho. NND has asked me to make some closing remarks to you today, but before I begin, I'd like to ask one of the First Nations youth, Josh Austin Sampson, to say a few words.
75% water at maturity, and 90% when it is newborn. Destruction or improper land use around wetland areas is ultimately to the detriment of all living things.
Excuse me, sorry, I apologize. This is the chair. We can't quite hear you, and we really do want to. So maybe if the volume can be cranked a little bit, that might be helpful.
Good afternoon. My name is Josh Austin. I am an 18-year-old First Nation of Na-Cho First Nation. I have heard various representatives about how important it is to protect wetland because they give life to all living things. Each human is comprised of 80% water, an animal is 75% water at maturity, and 90% when it is newborn. Destruction or improperly planned use of wetland areas is ultimately to the detriment of all living things. Is that better?
That's a little better, yeah.
Conservation Society spoke about the fact that wetland disruption should be avoided at all costs. Peatland could take up to upwards of 50 years to regenerate, and it will never be the same as it once was. Wetland studies need to come first, and they need to be comprehensive, which includes documentation from all of Yukon. Wetlands are habitats that have evolved together over millions of years, resulting in communities where they all make a living and contribute different values to the continuing health of their specific habitat. These are extremely interconnected ecosystems. Therefore, site-specific reclamation will not take into consideration the interconnectedness. Yukon government said that a reclamation plan must be drafted by proponents or on or around wetlands. I suggest that these plans be co-developed by proponent and affected First Nations to be consistent with the final agreements and striving towards co-management. Continued mining activity without holistic co-management perpetuates further destruction of water, land, and habitats. That has a direct impact on First Nations' connection to the land. We have heard from Klondike's Placer Miners Association that states that they are just pick and shovel operations who have an interest on being on the land with their families. However, that is a clear indication that they don't have the money to create reclamation plans in excess of millions of dollars. Economic wealth should not supersede inherent rights to practice traditional lifestyles which are protected in the Constitution. There are no thresholds that can be established that permits further destruction of cultural lifestyles. We need to ensure that we move forward in unity by establishing land use plans that take all parties' needs into consideration.
Thank you for those comments, Josh. And so to begin, I would like to say thank you again to the board for taking the time to hear our submission yesterday and again today. And more importantly, I'd like to thank the board for taking the initiative to hold this hearing in the public interest. As the last few days have made clear, this is an issue of the utmost importance to people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, throughout the Yukon. And giving an opportunity for views to be shared and information to be gathered is doubtless going to aid the board as it seeks to discharge its duties in a manner that's consistent, both with its statutory authority, but also, as I said yesterday, more essentially with its constitutional authority and its constitutional role. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the First Nation of Na-Cho and elders, youth, and other citizens who spoke yesterday and today. Their evidence and their testimony emerged from their lived experience on the land. It emerged from traditional knowledge that they and countless generations before have collected over millennia. We were able to hear directly from elders and knowledge holders in their own words and rooted in their own wisdom and their own relationship to their traditional territory. We heard the aspirations and the fears of the young people in the community who are apprehensive that they may not be able to share their culture with their children, that there will be nowhere left on the land to teach it. I urge the board to be mindful of the knowledge and the experience of the people who have lived upon and thrived upon the land, not just for 3 or 4 generations, but for hundreds and thousands of generations. The first issue I'd like to speak to is the question of balance. The issue of balance has come up again and again in presentations and in questions over the past 3 days, and it's an important issue to speak to. As one board member summed it up in a question he asked the Vuntut Gwitchin earlier today, how do we protect the river without putting too much pressure on mom and pop? But I would suggest that this question may misapprehend the nature of the balancing that needs to be undertaken. When engaging in a balancing exercise, considering whether or not to authorize placer mining in pristine wetlands, the board needs to consider not just the fact that there are divergent views and perspectives, but also the weight and the gravity of those divergent views. In our view, and without in any way seeking to diminish the importance of the livelihoods of the mom and pop operations who have been talked about over the past 3 days, and without in any way disregarding the value of people wishing to make their living placer mining in wetlands, I urge the board to take full account of the interests that are being brought forward and need to be weighed on the other side. We're talking about potential ecological damage that's not only irreparable, but that has consequences that are entirely unknown. You've heard this deep concern from Indigenous people from across the Yukon over the past 3 days, from the Vuntut Gwitchin in the north of the territory, to NND and TH, and all the way to Liard First Nation in the south. You've heard the concern that invaluable and irreplaceable repositories of culture will be forever lost. You've heard the concern that the connection between the land and the people could be fundamentally impaired and perhaps even severed. You've heard that an entire way of life, already imperiled by more than a century of mining and other development, is at risk of being lost entirely. You've heard the fear that the birthright of future generations could disappear. And so, as I spoke to you about yesterday, when you're undertaking that balancing question, when you're trying to understand the interests that are at play and how they should be weighed against each other, we urge you to consider the weight and the gravity of those Indigenous interests that have been communicated, and we urge you to consider the importance of the final agreements and the reconciled relationship that the entering into of the final agreements was supposed to promise. I want to share a quote from Justice Ian Binney of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Little Salmon Carmacks case, which was one of, I think, in fact, the first Supreme Court of Canada case to consider the UFA and the final agreements. And Justice Binney said the reconciliation of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians in a mutually respectful long-term relationship is the grand purpose of Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. The modern treaties, including those at issue here, attempt to further the objective of reconciliation not only by addressing grievances over the land claims, but by creating legal bases to foster a positive, long-term relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. The treaty is as much about building future relationships as it is about the settlement of ancient grievances. The future is more important than the past. A canoeist who hopes to make progress faces forwards, not backwards. And as the board undertakes that balancing exercise, we urge you to be mindful of the fact that the promises of the treaty have not yet been fulfilled. The promise of land use planning in Chapter 11 has not yet happened for the First Nation of Na-Cho. The commitment to co-management and co-governance has not been attained. And allowing and continuing to authorize placer mining in wetlands in the absence of the fulfillment of those treaty promises threatens to swamp that canoe that Justice Binney talked about. I also want to speak briefly about the issue of economic interests. I think we've seen the presumption over the past 3 days that there's a tension here, a tension between economic development on one hand and ecological protection and the preservation of Indigenous rights on the other hand. In fact, the presenter from Yukon government said something very much to that effect earlier today. And I'd like to suggest to the board that that's a false dichotomy. The value of undisturbed wetlands is not merely ecological and cultural. The value of undisturbed wetlands also has significant economic value to the Yukon as a source of harvesting, as a place of recreation and tourism, as a place for collecting medicines, as a repository of stored carbon, and a bulwark against the potentially catastrophic economic impacts of anthropogenic climate change. Conversely, and as we saw through TH's presentations yesterday, the costs associated with placer mining are enormous. Their costs to culture and way of life, constitutionally protected treaty rights, no doubt, but there's also costs in dollars. There's millions being spent by First Nations on engagement around proposed placer mining projects. There's millions more being spent by Yukon government and the various co-management boards. There's the costs of subsidies, the costs of remediation, and on it goes. And all of this for the short-term and transient economic benefits that come with the extraction of gold, and once it's gone, that gold is gone forever. Wetlands, however, preserved, ecologically stable, pristine wetlands provide value, economic value, not just cultural value, but economic value to the Yukon in perpetuity. So when considering this issue, and again, when engaging in that balancing, we urge you not to think of this as a dichotomy between economic interests on one hand and ecological and cultural interests on the other hand, but rather to recognize that those ecological and cultural interests have tremendous economic value in and of themselves, not just for Yukoners today, but for Yukoners for generations to come. I'd like to also return to the issue that I spoke about yesterday, which is the need for land use planning. And I think what's so important here is not simply land use planning as a treaty commitment, which I've spoken about already today, but also land use planning as a tool for certainty for all actors. We've heard again and again from the KPMA and the Chamber of Mines about the need to avoid duplicative expenses, to streamline regulatory processes, that miners need to know where they can go and where they should go early in the process. They need to know what they can do before they start making significant investments. Otherwise, they suffer tremendous prejudice. And they've acknowledged that land use planning is one of the tools which will help us get there. I'd like to affirm for the board that what causes cost is conflict. What causes cost is uncertainty. And the failure to implement land use planning as is required by the treaties, and the failure to gather the information which is necessary in order to fully understand wetlands and fully understand the impacts of those wetlands from development creates risk, creates cost, creates uncertainty, not just for Indigenous people, not just for miners, but for all Yukoners. It creates uncertainty in the board's decisions. It leads to litigation. It leads to wasted expense. And so, again, we return to the view, and this is the view that Chief Mervyn articulated so effectively at the end of our presentation yesterday, that we need to take a pause, that we're all on a treadmill right now. The placer miners are on a treadmill. Indigenous governments are on a treadmill. The board is on a treadmill. We're on a treadmill of application by application by application without sufficient consideration of the broader context, without the necessary information in place, without the underlying land use planning being done, without the treaty commitments being fulfilled. It's a treadmill and we need to get off of it. And so I would urge the board to do what it is in our submission, statutorily and constitutionally able to do, entitled to do, and in my view, required to do, which is take a pause and use its authority not to grant further licenses for placer mining in wetlands in Yukon until the underlying work has been done, until the information has been collected, and until the land use plans have been completed. Take a pause and allow the objectives of Chapter 11 of the First Nation of Na-Cho Agreement to be fulfilled. And I want to close with those. The objective of recognizing and promoting the cultural value of Indigenous people. The objective of utilizing the knowledge and experience of Indigenous people in order to achieve effective land use planning. And the commitment of ensuring that social, cultural, economic, and environmental policies will be applied to the management, protection, and use of land and water resources in an integrated and coordinated manner so as to ensure sustainable development. Thank you very much to the members of the board. Thank you again to Chief Mervyn, to our elders and our youth, and all of the members of the NND team who worked so hard to prepare this presentation. Thank you to the other Indigenous governments in Vuntut and Gwitchin and Liard First Nation, and to all of the other presenters over the last 3 days. That concludes our submissions.
Thank you, Mr. Frame. Thank you, First Nation Na-Cho for your closing comments. This brings us to the Chamber of Mines, please.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to get my screen to share here. I hope you can see that, Mr. Chairman.
We can, yes.
Once again, I'd like to thank the Water Board for having this hearing. I've been waiting many years to address some of these topics, and I'm very pleased to be here. Again, it's Randy Clarkson on behalf of the Yukon Chamber of Mines, and you've seen this slide before. I feel now we're at a crossroad, and we have a few options. I've listed 3 of them here. I mean, the first option is to shut down about 70% of the placer mining industry, including the Indian River drainage, which has 50% of the annual gold production. And we could do this through the imposition of stringent data collection requirements and a much more complex and expensive paperwork, which has been estimated at upwards of $160,000 for larger placer mines. And the problem with this is unlikely to have any impact on the final reclamation of wetlands. And we're pleased to hear from YG this morning that they're not supporting that outcome. That would be devastating to our industry and to the Yukon economy, and have many other impacts to service industries as well. The other option is to continue with the status quo and count on Mother Nature to continue the slow but sure process of passively reclaiming placer mined wetlands. Unfortunately, this results in less than optimal marsh and shallow water wetlands, and it's not an option that Chamber of Mines, or from my understanding, the KPMA supports. We would like to see these, we would like to improve reclamation techniques, and we would like to see all miners active in this reclamation. And in that order, we would like to embark on a new course where we incorporate simple, effective, and easily enforceable permit conditions. Permit conditions are hopeless if they can't be enforced, because there are always operators which would fail to follow them. There's ones that are doing those conditions now, but we need to make them universal. And they need to go into every placer mining land use permit. And this would both enhance natural reclamation and ensure the continued survival of the Yukon's second largest and most robust, the industry which has survived the Great Depression, the recessions. It's doing fairly well even through this pandemic, even though many other industries have shrunk considerably. And it's a family-owned mom-and-pop business, as I heard the previous presenter talking about. It's a family-owned and operated industry largely. This is, and again, we've experienced so much reaction to best management practices. I'm quite happy to call them anything you want, standard permit conditions. They really will end up being conditions of the Class 4 water license. And these are the reasons why best management practices or standard permit conditions work better for placer miners. Placer deposits are often erratic and they're difficult to predict where they are. We can't get public company financing because of that, so we have limited resources. Because it's extremely difficult, the ore reserves for placer deposits, so we need the flexibility to be able to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. We have permafrost issues, there's changes in grade, lots of conditions like that. Best management practices would provide the flexibility required for Yukon placer miners. They would allow the reestablishment of the appropriate saturation under flooded conditions, soils and topography, facilitate the natural development of a self-sustaining wetland. So they not only reestablish that, but they would enhance it by creating better habitat and making those wetlands reclaim much more quickly. And we're most interested in getting other governments and other stakeholders together and talk about any changes or revisions that may be required for these license conditions or best management practices, however we'd like to call them. Now, we've heard a lot of expert advice from different interveners here, from their technical experts. And a common theme from the technical experts is what might happen if placer mining continues in wetlands, as it has for the last 40 to 100 years. The unfortunate part of these experts' testimony is that they don't have any experience in placer mining, and most have not visited or have had only very brief visits. I think one had a 2-hour visit to the Indian River or to other Yukon wetlands to see firsthand of what's actually occurring. And when you don't have this on-site experience, you can't really offer good advice. You can only offer very generalized advice, and you can always think of the worst case scenarios of what might happen. But that's not really an accurate reflection of what's happening on site and under the actual conditions. We're very fortunate that we have decades of field evidence that placer mined areas are reclaiming passively into highly productive and diverse wildlife habitat. And this is all occurring without any assistance by mankind to a mix of uplands, marsh, and shallow water wetlands. And these wetlands also purify and regulate water flow. I would argue they do a better job than the original wetlands. So what we're proposing is, instead of focusing on extensive pre-mining studies and data collection, the experts should study the results of decades of operations in the wetlands. It seems a bit absurd to us that we would try and predict what was going to happen by measuring a whole number of conditions and collecting a bunch of data, when we can walk right out to the sites and see what's happening. The picture here this picture here shows you that the footprint we heard from Ducks Unlimited. Is it large? Why is there essentially undisturbed natural wetlands right next to the disturbance? Why is this worst case not happening? Why aren't the experts out there looking at the field conditions and determining if these worst case scenarios are actually occurring? We have evidence from Karen McKenna's maps where the peatlands and the swamps are located directly adjacent to disturbance, and they seem to be unaffected. They're still peatlands, they still are swamps, they still function as that. The worst case scenario has not occurred. In fact, they seem to coexist. Ducks Unlimited experts stated that marsh and shallow water wetlands should not be mined because they're very rare and they have incredibly diverse habitat. And yet that same expert recommends against miners reclaiming other common types of wetlands into marsh and shallow water wetlands due to concerns about what might happen during mining the original wetlands. That expert should come out and see what might happen. He should see how the virgin wetlands abut right up against disturbances. And contrary to presentations from the Yukon government and YCS and CPAWS and the Yukon Chamber of Mines, the duck expert also suggested we could reclaim peatlands back to peatlands by going through a very complicated process with layers of straw, organic soils, and harvested peat from nearby undisturbed wetlands. While that may be true in some areas, he failed to note that it is an exorbitant cost. There are long-term continuing maintenance issues over several decades and high failure rates of previous attempts to restore peatlands in southern Canada, even when they're attempted by companies with vast technical resources. I use the example of Northern Alberta and the oil sand companies, where they have tried to do that and essentially have reverted to reclaiming their peatlands to marsh and shallow water wetlands. And here's an example of some of that not worst case scenario, where we have wetlands, passive post-mined wetlands and shallow open water in the Indian River Valley. This is a copy of my earlier slide from yesterday. Why would you set up to do this? It's incredibly expensive, frustrating, and imprudent to attempt to reclaim post-mine sites to peatlands, given the high likelihood of failure. And if you do this, it's quite likely these flat and level areas would end up being dryland or upland habitat instead of any class of wetlands. And luckily, all classes of wetlands perform at least some of the same functions. And Jamie is quite right. It not only depends on the class of wetlands, but also as the doctor, I can't remember her name, I'm sorry, she appeared on behalf of TH. She also mentioned that it depends on where that wetland occurs, the climate, the geology, and the physical landforms, and so on. So they not only do the different classes have different functions and benefits, but it depends where they occur. And fortunately, and we can relatively easily reclaim these wetlands to marsh and shallow water wetland complexes, which are by far the most significant wetlands in terms of wildlife diversity. And again, Ducks has told us that as well. So, and while we're doing that, we have to look at the limitations of the placer mining industry. We need to realize that we haven't attempted to reclaim these any other way, but through passive and enhanced passive methods. So there's an extreme difficulty to predict the success of reclamation except through passive reclamation. And you have to look at the limited technical and financial resources and significant investments of placer miners. And again, on expert evidence, TH experts indicated it would be prohibitively expensive to reclaim placer mined wetlands because of the amount of heavy construction required to dig holes for ponds and create the surrounding rounded hills. And this again is a lack of local experience. This opinion is incorrect. These depressions and hills are already part of the post-mine landscape. The depressions are the open pits. The hills are the piles of overburden, which have been set beside the pits. They've all been shaped and covered with organic soil so that they reclaim quickly. Wetland costs can be very affordable, especially when they're incorporated into the mining plan. The idea that you would spend $250,000 to reclaim a post-mine area to a marsh and shallow water wetland is just simply incorrect. The NND expert advice wasn't based on Yukon information, knowledge, or experience. There was examples from quite far away, but nothing in the Yukon. And here's an example what the oil sands people have to do to create a marsh and shallow wetland. They have to dig out a hole. They have to do all this extra work that placer miners already have in their mining plan. It's part of their mining plan. They already have the open pit. It's already partly full of water. They just have to do some shaping and contouring and relatively minor adjustments to enhance it so that it becomes better habitat and it reclaims much more quickly. The board has also heard from dozens of Indigenous peoples and other concerned citizens, and that's rightfully so. They're very worried about their experts' worst case scenarios. If the worst case scenarios ever come about, it would be devastating. They do value wetlands very much, as I do. I live beside a wetland. I have for 35 years, and I value them very much. They've seen many changes due to mining. Mining transforms the landscape in the Indian River Valley. It transforms the peatlands and the swamps into marsh and shallow water wetlands, as well as small hills. They are concerned about the unreclaimed areas and the piles of coarse gravels, as is the industry. The coarse gravels don't look nice. They don't provide good habitat. Many of these areas that are in the photos, mine included, were areas which were mined prior to the introduction of mining land use regulations. Since 1998, placer miners are required to follow a number of standard land use conditions, such as contouring and covering exposed areas with the saved organic soils. So we need to realize that that's a thing of the past, and we have land use regulations currently to cover those gravel piles and make them into great upland habitat. They get covered with willows. Willows are a favorite browse of moose and many other creatures. There's also concerns about wildlife for hunting and trapping. Passively reclaiming wetlands provide very good wildlife habitat. Even ducks tells us that. Not so much that they're passively reclaimed, but the type of habitat, the marsh and shallow water wetlands are great. The wildlife tends to concentrate around the reclaimed open water wetlands. Whenever you dig a hole anywhere, whether it's South Africa or the Amazon jungle or the subarctic, and you fill it with water, it creates very good habitat and very diverse habitat. The animals tend to gather around it, and it's very productive, very diverse habitat. The new ponds are concentrating wildlife probably in different areas and occurred prior to mining, so there is a change there. And that's unfortunate, but it's hard to avoid. We heard a lot of talk about the precautionary approach, and there seems to be quite a few different definitions of the precautionary approach. Most times it was cited, it was kind of like the precautionary approach says, whenever you're concerned, you just don't do anything. So if you don't know everything, you don't do anything. But if you look at the 1992 Rio Declaration, it says where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Now, that's quite a different definition than how I've been hearing the precautionary approach used through this hearing process. And because of the speed of my, I required to do my presentation yesterday, I just want to go back over the recommendations, and I'll try and go through them quickly for you, Mr. Chairman. And the objective of wetland reclamation should be to reestablish the appropriate conditions so that you can facilitate the natural development of a self-sustaining wetland habitat. Self-sustaining is important. That's why we can't do peatlands. We don't have people around to watch over them for hundreds of years and ensure that they reclaim. We need to have them to be completely self-sustaining. And these reclaimed wetlands will usually be marsh and shallow water wetlands. The information required to support a water license application should include a conceptual mine plan and a conceptual reclamation plan. Doesn't mean they can't be detailed. Doesn't mean they can't be accurate, but they have to be able to be adapted to suit unforeseen and/or changing conditions. The application should indicate areas that contain pre-existing wetlands and approximately what proportion of these original wetlands will be disturbed and reclaimed into a mixture of low hill uplands and marsh and shallow water wetlands. I think we need to keep track of the original wetlands and what proportions have changed. The wetland conservation, development, and utilization should be considered on a regional scale, such as the Klondike Plateau. And in the event that placer mining is changing by more than some number, much greater than as we're seeing now, each new application may be required to leave some portion of the original wetlands undisturbed. The wetland information guidelines developed by the Palmer Group would be extremely costly to implement. Yet another example of a group making recommendations with no background in placer mining, and result in a dramatic shrinkage in the placer mining industry. It wouldn't necessarily do that. It would depend how they were implemented, but it has the potential to do that. And there's very little benefits to anyone except to wetland consultants and hydrological consultants. And this is a common thing. You need to be careful when you get recommendations from consultants that they're actually for your benefit and not for the consultant's benefit. These guidelines should be rejected or modified by the Water Board in favor of a simpler, cost-effective approach, such as modified BMPs that are easier to enforce and will actually enforce wetland reclamation. They're not paperwork, they're not studies of a fairly academic nature, they actually will enhance wetland reclamation. We all need to get together to review and amend and sanction the revised version of these KPMA's best management practices. Why the KPMA's best management practices? Because the KPMA spent 2 years in the field. They did all this field work. They have come up with these. They form a basis. They're not perhaps not the best BMPs in the world, but we need to get together and go over them and review them and amend them so that we can get on with it. The longer we argue, the longer we procrastinate, the longer we fight with each other, the longer these areas are going to go without optimum reclamation. These revised BMPs need to become part of the standard boilerplate conditions of any class 4 land use permit. Then they can be enforced. The inspector can land in the helicopter on the mine site and say, Frank, John, this pit is finished. You have to do all of these 10 or 12 or 20 items before I will clear that from you. And if you don't do them, you're going to be charged. That's how they have to be implemented. We need to provide training to both the miners and the mines inspectors so that the miners know what to do and the inspectors know how to enforce these new license conditions. Mines inspectors need to ensure the placer miners are adhering to these new conditions. Many of the complaints we heard over this hearing were because inspectors weren't enforcing. They weren't getting the miners to do some of the things they need to do now. We need to make the rules simple and easily enforceable. We need to train the inspectors, and we need to make sure that they ensure the miners are adhering to these new conditions. We shouldn't see any more gravel sticking out. We shouldn't see any more unreclaimed areas if the inspectors are out there and doing their job and they have the training to do that. Reclaimed areas should not require long-term maintenance and management, such as the peatlands that the Ducks have suggested we could reclaim to. Monitoring should be conducted to see if adjustments need to be made to these new license conditions from time to time. And we don't want to take this monitoring information to send the cats in and tear up areas that are partially reclaimed or reclaimed slightly differently than we thought they might. We want to use this monitoring to ensure that erosion has been limited, that the revegetation of the disturbed areas has occurred, and the reclaimed wetlands are saturated or underwater. Once we've reclaimed these wetlands and they're operating as wetlands, you will get those benefits. You will get carbon sequestration. Even marshes sequester carbon. I've seen in the pond outside my house is mostly submerged, decomposed weeds. Water is only a part of what's filling that open water. They do store water and control water. They allow water to flow through the whole year, including the late winter when other sources of water have diminished. And we need to ensure that the reclaimed waters are saturated or underwater. If they don't have water, they can't be a wetland. And that concludes my summary, Mr. Chairman, and I'm quite happy to answer any questions you might have for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Clarkson, and thanks to the Chamber of Mines for the closing comments. I'll just point out, and I will point out at the end of the meeting, that we will be formulating questions, and I will indicate how that might occur. But thank you again, and this brings us to the Vuntut Gwitchin government.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Why? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Just had a nap. Just kidding. Okay, I think some closing comments. I think there's a lot said about Indian River and the Yukon is, and my previous mine is 190 something square miles. 190,000 square miles, somewhat land. So there's a lot of land out there, except for only, so that's the case. So I think maybe there's got to be a different basis to look at how we could look at another river system and to how the mining takes place with that. And I think and the effects that it has. But if you look at Indian River, what has never been shown is the last 4 river bends on the Indian River going into the other river system there. And those last 4 bends on the Indian River has never been mined, but I think they want to get in there. So I think if there's anything that needs to be left to this natural state, is those last 4 river bends on the Indian River. I think that would be something of value to keep, and also look at other areas. But I think all in all, just my closing comments, I hope we could work out and find a balance for what the economy would be for the Yukon, and what mining would be, placer mining, and all the decision makers that are involved, and what the Yukon would look like 20, 30 years from now, First Nations and YG and federal government that have jurisdiction in terms of making decisions over some of these areas for wetlands, and what we're going to protect for wetlands, and the original wetlands. The wetlands has been reclaimed, and how that affects the whole ecosystem of the areas, and basically how placer mining really affects the north nowadays. If you look at say for example Indian River, Indian River there, they can't mine the middle. It's already been mined, so they're going into the hillside where they got to move. Now they got to move 30 to 20 feet of overburden. They call it overburden. So 130 to 30 to 20 feet of soil they got to move. That's the depth, and the width I don't know, but that's the depth they got to go. So where does all that soil go to, and what happens with all that soil? And what kind of effects that has on that ecosystem there, and the silt getting into the water, the soil getting into the water, the soluble solids getting into the water, and how that just affects the whole ecosystem. And I think maybe there's got to be some measure of legislation for all that. And change is inevitable. So with protecting wetlands and what that's going to be for the future, that's inevitable. It's going to happen. So how we do it collectively, and protect some of the original wetlands as is, and basically look at the areas that you can mine. And there's other things said globally in the world, as George W. Bush would say, we're addicted to oil. The previous president of the United States. So we're looking at a number of people who are addicted to gold. So that's historically, that's been proven from 1898. So the question is, what do we do for what's reasonable for the Yukon in terms of economy and environment in that regards? So nevertheless, that's my closing comments, and thanks for holding this hearing, and we'll talk again soon. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Mr. Njuli, and thank you to the Vuntut government for their closing comments. And finally, we turn it over to the Yard First Nation and closing comments.
Mr. Chair, Travis Stewart, do this. Thanks to all of the participants work and for bringing such clarity show us in love. Are you able to hear?
I can hear you, I think, and I think a picture of Mr. Milton is on the screen.
Yeah, that's me, Mr. Milden. Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you. Yes, go. Please proceed.
Sorry, will I just be repeating what I just said?
Sorry.
Elevan just wanted to say thank you very much to the board for providing this opportunity, and thank you for everyone who provided their thoughtful input and time. And I know the new LFN Chief and Council really look forward to the opportunity to work with the board and look at creative ways to solve the issues that face us together. Shugasinla.
Thank you, Mr. Milton, and thanks to LFN for their contribution today. I would like to ask the indulgence of the participants to allow us to break for 10 minutes. We want to line up our the person providing for the prayer and just finish closing comments. So we are now at about 2 o'clock Yukon time. So let's agree to meet at 2:10 for wrap up. So 2:10 and we'll reconvene. Thank you. For us, the board appreciates this active participation very much. I want to thank my colleagues who joined with me for these proceedings and who will be working with me as we move through the decisions in the future. I would like to thank our recorder and sound technician as well as the staff here at the Yukon Arts Center for making the production of the virtual event possible. I'd also like to thank our legal counsel, technical consultant, and secretariat staff. The board is an information inquiry-based board, and the more robust and clear information we have to consider as we deliberate matters, the better. The board will provide an information request on Monday, November 9th. It will be provided to all parties. Parties will then have 3 weeks until Monday, November 30th to respond to the questions. All responses will be uploaded onto Waterline. Parties will then be given 2 weeks until Monday, December 14th to provide written summaries on all the information provided. To summarize, an information request will be issued on Monday, November 9th. Parties will have until Monday, November 30th to respond. And finally, all parties and the public will have until Monday, December 14th to provide final written submissions to the board on all information received during these proceedings. All written summaries will be uploaded onto Waterline. After the conclusion of this hearing, our consultant, Mr. Steve Morrison, will prepare a What We Heard document in conjunction with Secretariat staff. The board intends that this document will reflect the spectrum of perspectives we've heard over the last 3 days, as well as what is provided in the written submissions. We anticipate that a draft will be available early in the new year. Looking to the future, the board has several options available to it as outcomes following this public interest hearing. Section 18 of the Waters Act permits the board to make recommendations to the minister as it considers appropriate concerning any matter in respect of which the minister may make Waters Act regulations or reserve lands for disposition. Making recommendations to the minister is one of the options available to the board to action items based on what we've heard. The board will be reviewing its wetland information guidelines based on what we have heard from these proceedings. These guidelines, intended to be a tool to assist applicants in the type of information the board requires to deliberate water license applications for undertakings affecting wetlands. I am adjourning the public hearing until Monday, December 14th, 2020 at 4 p.m. Yukon time, the date on which the final written submissions to the board are due. And I would like to ask Mr. Stan Lajutli to provide a closing prayer.
You go. Okay. I'm going to say a prayer in my language and for a blessing of for this hearing and probably for the future. So here we go. Nwegawadat chukdrin di kokona and ji chuadriki hi chitsai chanadriki hi chana dinji onji kai chanza dinji ju nangi da chu changi jitsi so chana chitsai gi da chu nangi da chu chana ayen jit ko inji gujit ai ko sanasi nwegawa ji gujit diendo trina gita da chanjit sakuri dene guri ka chanjit ko ai ko san ko inji gujit ai ko sanasi nwegawa that amen. Asi. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend.